Noah stood at the edge of the great hull as the first light of a cold dawn washed over the timbers, and for a moment the whole world seemed reduced to wood and seam, and the task God had set him to accomplish. He had known the measurements from the beginning, 300 by 50 by 30 cubits, and these numbers had become as much a part of him as breath. He could see, even now, the logic of them. Length sufficient for the beasts and for the family. Breadth for stability on a sea that would be like no sea the earth had seen. Height enough to permit 3 tiers within, each layer a world unto itself. Stay until the end to see how every system worked and how faith and craft came together. Subscribe and turn on notifications so this account of skill, providence, and survival reaches those who need its reassurance. The work began in a dry plain where the earth had long forgotten the taste of rain. Men who would otherwise have called him eccentric watched while Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, laid out the keel with a carefulness that was almost worshipful. Their tools were simple: axes hewn from bronze, wedges forged and hammered by hand, ropes of twisted fibers, and pegs of seasoned timber. Yet in their simplicity, the family practiced a kind of architecture that married order to necessity. They cut ribs, each beam set against another with mortise and tenon, binding the frame in a lattice that would resist both the pressing weight of water and the torsion of great swells. The hull was not a mere box, it was a spine and rib cage, a crafted refuge whose geometry acknowledged the sea's appetite for chaos. When the narrator, speaking as one who has examined the texts and the traces that remain in human crafts, converts the sacred cubit into familiar measures, the dimensions take on a modern clarity. Roughly 400 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. That expanse, comparable to a 4-story building laid on its side, or several fields joined end to end, created a volume sufficient to shelter life. The proportions themselves are a lesson. A long, narrow beam resists rolling. Breadth offers buoyancy. Height allows for storage and separation. Contemporary studies from scholars who seek to reconcile ancient report and physical possibility note that these proportions are extremely conservative, a deliberate margin that reads as prudence rather than chance. They lined the hull with pitch, bitumen heated and stirred until it would accept no leak as a king repels treachery. The smell of the pitch clung to skin and garment, an acrid perfume of earth and tar that mingled with sawdust and sweat. The men applied it in bands, in seams, in places where joint met joint. In colder days they warmed it by hearth, in hotter days they flowed soft and malleable. Along the inside, the family set up a framework of posts and crossbeams. These would support decks, partitions, and the places where animals would rest. Noah, so face creased by years and resolve, marked the intervals of the beams himself, measuring and remeasuring as if the care of the measurement itself was a prayer. They spoke little of numbers while they worked, yet numbers followed them. They spoke of kinds, not of modern names. The mandate had specified pairs of every living kind and additional clean animals as the text records. Noah and his sons discussed practical categories, creatures of weight and size that demanded strong pens near the keel, creatures that needed air and light and must be housed higher up, beasts that nested and required nesting materials, and flocking creatures that had to be kept with calm company lest panic cross the pens like fire. The notion of kinds allowed for a manageable taxonomy. Not all species in detail, but inclusive groupings adequate for stewardship. Later, those who study genetics will offer models that place many modern species within broader ancestral groups. For Noah and his household, stewardship required observation, not modern classification. On the question of numbers, how many beasts could a vessel of this size accommodate? Practical imagination helps. The 3 decks provided layered real estate. Heavy creatures took the lower level nearest the keel, where the motion was least. Medium and smaller animals occupied the mid and upper decks, where ventilation and light were better. Barriers of wood and woven reeds formed stalls. Straps and simple collars controlled movement. Feed troughs and water basins were rigged so that one man could tend several spaces in an hour. Grain and fodder were stored in bins along the internal bulkheads, stacked in sacks treated with ash and oil to deter spoilage. Salt, too, kept meat and seeds preserved where needed. Smoke curing in a low, constant warmth extended beyond mere preservation into ritual and routine. Noah's family had no engineers in the modern sense, but their work showed an understanding of principles that modern seafarers would recognize. They used the hull's length to align weight fore and aft. They placed ballast of packed stones and heavy stores low to keep the center of gravity down. They fashioned slatted floors to allow urine and loose straw to fall through into boards beneath that could be emptied by hand. Simple gravity and labor replacing any need for mechanical pumps. Ventilation came from a system no less clever. The ark's roofline and the placement of apertures created convection. Warm air, laden with animal breath and the heat of bodies, rose through higher hatches. Cooler air moved in, drawn by the hearths and the natural draft. The opening that Scripture mentions functioned as both rooflight and chimney, a controlled breach to light, to air, to the sense of being seen by the heights. In the long months before the rains came, the family rehearsed the routines that would carry them through chaos. They built chord passages, learned the temper of each beast, and named the places where feed was to be received. They practiced the making of salt and the smoking of meat. They learned to tend a mare and a dove, to soothe a fawn. Noah walked the decks at dusk and morning, cataloging and comforting, speaking to animals and to God with equal familiarity. His voice, low and cracked, but steady, kept the rhythm. At times he taught his sons to read the grain and to judge when a stall needed mending, when a rope needed rerunning. Care is worship, he would say. Order is obedience. Neighbors watched them with scorn or curiosity. There were murmurs in the villages. A man of 6 centuries taking up such a task drew jibes and laughter. Yet Noah's patience outmatched contempt. Tradition suggests that he labored a long time, years enough to be a sign in the land, and during that time he both spoke and labored. If there was preaching, it accompanied hammer strokes and seam filling, and his family's faith took on a practical hue. They were a household trained to survive by doing what God commanded, and by anticipating needs before they arose. When at last the heavens broke, the first storms were deceptive. Sheets of rain that swelled streams and made gullies where none had been. Then the fountains of the deep were opened, and waters came from beneath the earth in a way the land had never known. The sea became a new maker of music. The thunder of waves on the outer planking, the groan of timbers as they flexed under loads they were not meant to know, the keening cry of animals disquieted by unfamiliar motion. The ark rode up and down like a house afloat, at times lifted gently on a swelled back of water, at times pitched and nearly rolled. For 40 days and nights the rain fell without interruption, Thereafter, the waters prevailed upon the earth, covering even the highest hills. Inside, life adopted a strict rhythm. Shem, Ham, and Japheth learned to work without rest, feeding, cleaning, mending. They devised schedules so that no one pen was neglected. By day, the oil lamps burned in sheltered recesses, their light honeyed and small. The scent of burning oil mixed with the heavier odors of animals and the persistent smell of damp pitch. Night held the burden of noise. The groaning of the ark was never wholly absent, and the family took to sleeping in shifts, so that at least one could be awake to watch for any new threat, or to tend a sudden sickness. Fear was present, but it did not rule. They held to a discipline born of instruction and necessity. Hygiene, under such conditions, demanded ingenuity. Noah's household set aside wash areas and used ash and oil for sterilization. No modern disinfectants, only the wisdom of smoke and heat. They isolated animals that seemed weak, tended with soothing herbs and poultices of boiled plant matter, and relied on the natural resilience of life. And Dizandro, among these animals, the stronger sometimes tended the weaker with surprising tenderness. Herds calmed in the presence of the family's steady hand. The ark, for all its contained chaos, became a school of adaptation, where patience and daily care were the instruments of survival. There were moments that felt like grace in the midst of terror. A mother bird would find the slats and fashion a nest where no one had thought to leave room. A foal took its first hesitant steps upon the middeck, wobbling on timber that had tasted only air before. Noah walked among such moments with an awe that was not merely practical. He marked them in his heart like prayers, small confirmations that life, though pressed and contorted, clung stubbornly to being. When drought yields to dew in the morning, a man senses the same quiet miracle in miniature. Scholars who examine the account have long debated specifics: how to reconcile the number of animals with available space, how to interpret clean and unclean categories in terms that make sense for provision, how to account for fresh water and for waste management on a craft without modern systems. One plausible reconstruction reads the instruction for extra clean animals as both ritual and provision. Clean animals could be used for food under extreme conditions, reducing demand on stored grain. Storage strategies favored dense, long-lasting staples, barley and wheat in sacks, dried roots and jerky, smoked fish where available. Fodder for ruminants was compacted and stored in dry bins. Hay and straw were kept lofted and away from damp so that there would be bedding when needed. Water was gathered in cisterns and in hollowed vats. Rainwater, when it could be stored, supplemented limited freshwater reserves. All of this required discipline and a regime of rationing that the family maintained with grim patience. The taxonomy of the animals aboard the ark is another point where faith and reason meet. The text speaks in terms appropriate to its age, families and kinds rather than binomial classifications. Yet plausible biological models suggest that ancestral kinds could encompass the genetic diversity later expressed in many species, given time and adaptation. Those who study such matters note that the ark's cargo must be understood in terms of feasibility. Broad groups, juveniles where possible to reduce space and food need, and an expectation that post-diluvian diversification would follow environmental pressures and genetic variability. Noah's practical mind favored pairs, but also an economy of space. Where fitting, he and his sons would prefer the younger, less demanding representatives. Days blurred into one another, until the passage of months made the calendar an abstract thing. Scripture counts approximately 370 days in the house of the ark, a span that tests both flesh and spirit. The men measured time by the tilt of the sun and the maintenance cycles of their stores. Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era Sun and the maintenance cycles of their stores. Você está no meio de uma frase. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. At some junctures, they marked half a year by the need to replace bedding, to rehabilitate a stall, to mend the seam where a new leak had appeared. Their souls, like their hands, kept working. At times, the sea wanted to teach lessons about humility. A storm would arise that tossed the great vessel and made even seasoned men confess the limits of their control. The roar beyond the planking was immense, an orchestra of water, wind, and the distant collapse of structures that had not been built for such waves. Inside, the family clung to rhythm and prayer. At dawn, they would gather in a small, cleared place, a corner of the upper deck where light fell from the opening. Noah would speak a few words of remembrance and petition, not long sermons, but a steady practice of trust. Where faith was tested, it was cemented in shared labor, mending a tether, comforting an anxious creature, listening to a son recount a broken thought. Their unity was both spiritual and technical. Voices from beyond the ark's work, later readers and critics, might press questions about the possibility of such an enterprise. The reply offered here is not triumphalist, but explanatory. Proportion, prudence, and simple mechanisms make the ark's design plausible. The use of bitumen for sealing is attested in ancient Near Eastern construction. The girding with beams and the use of mortise joints were crafts known to many peoples of antiquity. Ventilation by convection and light through a roof opening are basic principles that any carpenter could exploit. The genius, if genius there was to be named, lies in obedience, in the willingness to follow precise dimensions and to prepare for contingencies. Divine instruction gave form. Human hands executed it. There were quieter tensions too. The sons, young and strong, sometimes chafed at the monotony. They longed for fields and for the ease of harvests. Their wives bore the heavier load of tending and nursing the smaller beasts, and yet their courage became the backbone of the household. At times, an argument would flare over rations, over a decision to move a partition, over the right way to soothe a restless mare. But these were family frictions, not schisms, and they resolved in the common work. Each evening found them gathered, voices low, the sound of the ark a distant thrum. They shared memories of the land before the rains, of trees and markets, and the laughter of neighbors, recollections that now had the warmth of relics. As months turned, small signs of the water's subsiding emerged. Ridges of mountain appeared like islands on the horizon. Currents slowed in places where unseen undersea currents redirected the flood. Noah would climb the outer deck and look to the world as if reading it anew, searching for changes. The animals, too, seemed to sense shifts, migrations of birds in the upper air, the changing color of the water from muddy churn to a calmer blue. Hope, which had been careful and measured, began to breathe with a deeper rhythm. And then there came the moment when land loomed, when the ark grounded upon the slopes of what the people later called Mount Ararat. The shuddering of impact sent a chorus of sound across the decks. Animals call, men exhale, and wood settles with the resignation of labor. For a spell, there was a silence that was almost holy. Men and beasts pressed to the upward edges and peered into a world both familiar and utterly altered. Noah, older now in ways that numbers could not show, felt an overwhelming tide of gratitude and awe. He set up an altar, as the text records, and gave thanks, smoke rising, scent of burnt offerings mingling with mountain air. The landing was not merely physical, but symbolic. It confirmed that careful design and steadfast obedience had endured the maximum test. The ark's systems, its storage, its routines, its ventilation, had not only kept bodies alive, but had preserved the social and moral fabric of a family that would be the seed of a new nation. The covenant that followed, sealed by the sign of the rainbow, reframed the enterprise. This was no longer merely survival, but the beginning of a renewed relationship between Creator and creation, a promise and a future. This story, recounted from the dual vantage of Scripture and plausible reconstruction, invites a response not merely of admiration for craft, but of faith in providence. The ark stands as an image of ordered refuge amid chaos, and as a testimony that human obedience paired with divine instruction can produce wonders that reason alone can scarcely foresee. For those who wrestle with questions of possibility, the account offers both engineering answers and spiritual assurance. Proportions, materials, and labor suffice. Providence supplies what the hands cannot contrive. If this account stirs conviction in your heart, declare it quietly between breath and belief. Reflect on the ways your life might be built with the same prudence, measuring, sealing, sheltering, and allow the ark's lesson to challenge the complacencies of the day. The story of Noah is not an antiquarian curiosity, but a template for trust. Prepare well, act faithfully, endure patiently, and give thanks when the land appears. Noah turned then from altar to field. He tended the soil, planted a vineyard, and in time tasted the wine of his labor. There came a moment of weakness. He lay uncovered within his tent. His son Ham saw and spoke of it, but Shem and Japheth went back with a garment and covered their father with reverence. When Noah awoke and perceived what had been done, words of sorrow and of future consequence passed his lips, brief, grave, and history carried them onward. Thus, the new beginning bore both promise and imperfection. The covenant of the Lord remained. The bow in the cloud held fast as sign and seal.